Alex. I think we can. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I got it.
Yeah, and just confirming since Matt is here, Matt, since Giuseppe is not in the room, do you think it would be okay to just start? Or
I think you can give it another minute, and then after that, you're probably good to start.
no worries. Yeah.
Sorry, am I going to start?
Mm. Yeah, I think we can start. Since unfortunately, I think the Giuseppe is also indicated as not online in Discord. So yeah, in that case, the disconnection policy kicks in, unfortunately. But I'm wishing everybody the very best of luck then. So yeah, Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
I clearly visible and audible.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, yes to both.
Let me open my timer. I'll be, sorry. I'll begin my speech in three, two, one. I'm going to talk about the farmer, then I'm going to talk about farmers generally in the developing world, then I'm going to talk about lowering global pollution and switching to green energy. Let's start with the farmer. The farmer needs the money. Why? The farmer is currently facing a loss of income and career. They lose their lifestyle and their region, their ability to live and grow in their plot of land, and and live in the lifestyle that they inherited from their own ancestors. And they can't easily transition because these issues affect many farmers in the region and many farms in the region. It means that there's a lack of farms to be worked and an overabundance of farmers looking for other jobs. It could lead to a loss of home, either direct or indirect, when you can no longer live in the place where the only thing you can work while living there is working in the farm, where you can no longer afford your house, or your house itself gets overrun by those same rising sea levels. We also think that how does the money therefore help this person? First, it's just restitution. It lets them afford to re-educate, move to upskill, move to a different location. But secondly, we also think that it creates deterrence on future harms happening in the future. We think, therefore, the farmer principally deserves it. The harms borne by him are massive. They were predictable and have been known for over 50 years by big energy companies. When a person is harmed directly by the actions of another, we believe that there's a moral obligation to financial restitution. And we also think they principally deserve a recognition of justice, being told that it is not legitimate that their lifestyle, the lifestyle of billions around the world, was destroyed for corporate greed. Already at this point, we prove the most definite benefit in this debate. Even if no precedent is set, the firm doesn't care about this chump change, but this actor does. But second, but not beyond that, that we think that the same analysis applies for all farmers. They all need the money, they all deserve it for the same reasons. I'm going to now explain how this trickles down to them. First, I have the burden that the ruling will likely create precedent and be used by courts in other developed countries. We think this is especially true in Europe and Germany. Note the precedent in Germany is really significant on its own because many polluters are based there and function there in the industrial manufacturing powerhouse of Europe. But this precedent is likely also going to apply to the rest of Europe who recognize German court cases. Beyond that, though, there's a political and ideological zeitgeist of both post-colonial restitution as well as of punishing big energy and bringing about the green transition, which is why we think that politicians, for instance, aren't likely to change laws in order to prevent this from happening. Finally, opposition have a strong incentive to agree with us on this burden, so I'm going to move on, and if opposition contend against it, Amita will prove it further. Let's explain now why the areas that and people who are most affected by climate change have no alternatives to pursuing justice. Note that they can't do it internally in their own courts. This is first because these companies don't work locally. So the company doesn't even need to show up to a court case in Peru. They don't care. There's no standing as far as they're concerned. But secondly, local courts in developing countries, even when you do function them, there are far more susceptible to influence. This both looks like foreign influence from foreign actors that you get through your own political lobbying, but also through direct political lobbying in those countries. The ability to push in tons of money in order to decrease regulations and make it easier for pollutants to function in those countries is a rampant problem. This is bad because we think that people should have the ability to control the things that affect them most. When I'm most affected by climate change and the harms of climate change towards me in a developing country, I should have the ability to affect that. But secondly, people deserve to have access to justice. Just because whoever perpetrated against me is stronger than me and I can't hold them to account doesn't mean that they shouldn't be held to account. And finally, we need to create deterrence on bad behaviors. One of the core reasons why we have laws and justice is in order to prevent future harms happening to others. Currently, there is no incentive to fix behaviors or deterrent against these bad behaviors. This precedent is therefore unique. This precedent is needed to help people living in the global south who have no alternative way of achieving this precedent or this justice. I want to explain why the harms of the environment are so bad to those farmers all over the world, and not just to farmers, also to workers, also to just people living in the slums. First, it's the sea levels rising as a result of the ice caps melting, as a result of temperatures rising. This leads to a contamination of water supplies by salt water rising and infiltrating freshwater aquifers. It directly makes homes collapse or makes farms overrun by water. And it ruins the water supplies that you need in order to grow your food and live. But secondly, it's also direct agricultural destruction of crops. It's things like an erratic monsoon season, making it impossible for you to plan your growing and planting seasons, or areas becoming just too hot to live in, or to work in, or to grow crops in around the equator. Also, these harms also exacerbate and lead to a global food crisis, where as we have a rising population and a lack of ability to scale up our food manufacturing, but we quickly are losing access to our food, to our farming lands, then we create a situation where people can't afford their food. The world is very reliant on, is very susceptible to food crises. Think what happened when Ukraine's farm exports were cut off because there is very little overhang. There's very little spare food being produced, and there's a very static demand for food. These harms also affect many people. We would contend billions of people and the profits go to a select few. We solve this in two ways. First, we just give these people money directly. We allow these people to engage in class action lawsuits. We allow for entire regions to be represented in court cases and get the money that, just like in my first burden, explain that these people are able to both benefit directly from this restitution and then are able to pursue alternative lives. But we also create deterrence. And before I explain how we lower global pollution and incentivize switching to green energy, let's take a POI from opening.
Yeah. How many people and how fast do you think these court settlements will happen?
It doesn't have to be. First of all, I think that as more precedent happens, it happens more and more quickly because the courts know how to handle these sorts of cases. But also in my next analysis, I'm going to explain that we're not reliant on the court settlements happening, but the fear of them happening is already enough. Let's talk about lowering global pollution and quickening the transition to green energy. Note that we are already close to it. Solar is currently cheaper than dirty fuels. So is hydro power. The reason is that both of these are renewable and keep extracting more, you can just use your existing facilities to produce new energy. You can also produce liquid hydrogen fuel using both of these so that you can replace gasoline and have a transmittable source of fuel. The problem, therefore, is transition costs, retrofitting energy plants, engines, fixing manufacturing lines. Note that specifically existing polluters are heavily invested in green tech for two reasons. First, because of their advantages in entry. They were already manufacturing engines. They already had contracts for energy with states and energy plants, making it easier for them to enter the space. But more importantly, it diversified them against their own biggest risk and maintained investor confidence of future pro-green regulations. Therefore, this is sufficient incentive to be the tipping point. The direct payments themselves are massive. But beyond that, you have unpredictability for investors and for the states that subsidize or support these dirty polluters. You have their name getting tarnished and class actions rising up, which means that we have significant incentive for them to do the final stretch and become green. For all of these reasons, opening government.
Great. Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for those very fine remarks. And to open the case in the opposition side of the House, Leader Val. Here.
Am I perfectly audible?
Yep.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Opening government's principle relies on two things. First, on it being direct. The second, on there's not being any alternatives. The first, on dealing with why this is not direct. Info slide quite literally mentions this company is in Germany. There is no way, no perfect way to calculate what is direct and what is indirect insofar as environmental harms are accumulated by the actions of all people, all companies in general, starting from people like the first ever factory created in the world, I don't know, in 1670, whenever it was, till like, I don't know, the last minute. So I'm unclear why they actually tagline this as like direct harm. I'm like they really need to fix this. But second is that they tell you, there's absolutely no alternatives for farmers, and like this is the easiest possible way for them to, I don't know, get this amounts of money and whatnot. I have 5 responses to this. First is that quite literally, there are natural disaster funds. Insofar as when countries realize they're prone to natural disasters, things like floods and whatnot, they have ministries set up in order to deal with a vast majority of the population if they're affected in certain ways. Second, like quite literally, like I'm from Bangladesh. It's a very flood-prone country. There are literally like governments, like whole ass ministries, like created in order to help the people in Sylhet, for instance. But third is that farmers who form a huge population of these countries that they characterize oftentimes have the bargaining power by forming things like farmers union, for instance, because majority of the people in these developing unions rely on agriculture. For instance, these farmers unions have significant bargaining power in these specific instances where natural disasters do hit you. Fourth is that governments actually have incentives to protect them because they rely on agriculture for their comparative advantage. That's literally the only thing that you can trade with, which means that those farmers are probably people that you probably care about the most in your economy. But fifthly, is that you probably also care about things like re-election. Because these form such a huge population of your country, the aggregate of the state at the end of the day becomes the incentives of the people as an accumulated form, which means that governments, like there are alternatives, which means their principle on there being no alternatives existing is actually not true. I'll take Pew as in chat, please. Second is they talk about like class action lawsuits and like how you can like solve like huge amounts of like problems and like courts are going to get better over time. I'm going to deal all of this in my constructive then. First is that why is the current court system extremely overburdened, and why this will not be done in proper ways? In fact, it's going to be done in really poor ways. First is that note that currently there's like not enough judges because there's like a huge backlog of cases. We all know how overburdened every single court of every single country is. But second is note that this is civil case in general, and for civil cases you need public prosecutors, which means that there is already a shortage of it. You probably have to redistribute it in other ways, which means there is an active opportunity cost for all of these things. Now, in order to what's the biggest distinction in this debate, and I think opening government is correct in identifying, is that this will create the precedent. The fact is, when a precedent happens, it is not like, it's not a norm, it's more like a switch, which means that every single person from tomorrow onwards will be able to file cases, and every single lawyer will have the responsibility to deal with it the way this case was dealt with, which means that this happens in a very short amount of time, which means that this probably creates an incredible amount of pressure in very small amounts of time. I think then what happens is that infinite number of people have the ability to sue these companies, like, I don't know, at given points in time. Firstly, there is an ambiguity to begin with, which means that there's probably going to be research and analysis on how much it was affected. But note that environment and pollution and all of these things are accumulated things. So who is to say that 0.4, like, I don't know, like that like my land getting like burnt or whatever, or like going away with floods, who is to say that this is not a result of like fossil fuels that was like done or like fossil fuels by some industry in the 1750s, for instance? Like, I could technically just sue them because the whole environment, if opening government's characterization is right, if that's an aggregate, then they actually fall under that aggregate. I should, by that principle, be able to sue them. I think then the problem is that this becomes the case in and of itself becomes extremely huge. But second is that there is a huge number of people who would probably want to buy into it at the shortest possible instance. People realize that the courts are overburdened. People realize that these things, if you don't act fast, means that you will probably not be able to get the money, which means that within the shortest period of time, the maximum number of farmers who are strapped on cash, for instance, are probably going to jump onto this. This probably means that the national courts then become, I don't know, like a climate tribunal or for tribunal sort of a thing, which means that at the end of the day, you probably are not effectively dealing with any of the things that for the farmer that opening government wants to solve, because at the end of the day, you probably cannot cater to any of these people in a meaningful way. Before anything, closing.
Yeah, so there are two things that exist to solve your problem. First, class action lawsuits, and secondly, tests of remoteness and other legal tests to make sure that these are not frivolous cases. Both of those things deal with both your problems.
Yeah, I'm unclear why, like, I don't know, like, I'm unclear why there's like democratization of information for all of these farmers in developing countries if those are the people you want to protect. Like, presumably, there are incentives of companies to keep them as far away from these lawsuits for in the very first place. Chances are they're probably going to take actions in those manners. I don't really have to provide they're so powerful. But the second thing I want to talk about is broader environment in general. Note that currently, like, energy prices are very, very high in the post-COVID world. I think it's incredibly important to note that FDI in the energy sector in developing countries is extremely, extremely important for people to consume things like basic things like electricity, for instance. I think currently there is an opportunity cost of companies going green. So even if, like, opening government mentioned that, like, this has been cheap, this has not been easy for companies, which means that you increase the opportunity cost, which means that you probably turn them back onto their usual methods of polluting more, of usual methods of doing things that you're doing more pollution related actions, right? I think that at the end of the day, the impacts of them are disproportionately on things like increasing costs of energy, for instance, increasing costs of, like, I don't know, like unit per unit cost of energy and all that stuff, right? I think this is particularly important because at the end of the day, this will affect the developing world the most, and farmers who probably don't have capacity for any of these things, you probably hurt them more, because you probably not only just take away the basic things from the farmers, but it probably means that you take away basic things like electricity from the population in general, which means that the harm is quite exacerbated. For all those reasons, very proud to oppose.
Right. Great. Thank you very much, Speaker, for those very kind remarks. Now to continue to conclude OG's case, DPM, please. Here.
Okay. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. I'm going to quickly clear out the things that I think are extremely low impact, that are the claims coming from OO. Then I'll engage with why our solution is unique to both incentivizing solar and hurting the sort of destruction that Ayala explains more directly, even if you don't buy clean energy subsidies, and wait against what should be the opt case, which is the last line of LO about rising energy costs and deindustrialization. Let's start with responding to the LO quickly. On the principal idea, so their argument here is that it can't be quantified, and thus a legal claim against the firm is illegitimate. I want to respond to this, and this will also respond to an op that tries to say they will evade more, which is how they will skirt away from the sort of precedent claims that we're allowing to be made. So notice that the environmental movements in academia in the West have had an incentive to gather ways on collecting information on these sort of firms, for the simple reason that it makes such action suits much easier. And the ways that they do this is both through modeling that it uses symptomatic things we see on the ground, like the sort of debris that you face, and associate it with a specific firm's production techniques. But secondly, they also use regulations that governments in the West require of their companies. For example, you have to disclose your environmental regulations or the techniques you use in developing countries in order to make sure that you stand by WTO regulations, which means the government has a lot of information about these firms and is thus able to be used in all sorts of precedent cases domestically within developed countries. So there's a lot of information about what sort of environmental harms they're creating that gets scurried off to environmental movements that they can then use. Given we're talking about the same firms with the same general production techniques, when we collude on such a massive scale with agents that press class action suits, we think we can be meticulous about this, which is why Ayal's explanation of damage works well to explain why the principle should still work. Second thing that they say is that there's court backlog, which is an insanely low impact argument, but let's engage with it anyway. First, you can pick whatever court has the least backlog because you can file in any court. This is exactly the strength of this mechanism. Second, many adverse
adversarial courts in Europe, like in Germany, the reason it was picked instead of the US is because adversarial courts have much less backlog than courts such as the ones in the US that follow common law, because they tend to have a judge decide much more quicker without all sorts of demands for lawyers making decisions. Finally, notice that higher courts, like the regional court that made the decision, as explained in the info slide, have far less backlog on them because most claims get solved in lower courts, which is why there's a lot of legal space to do that. Moving on to some things I want to clarify about why our solution is unique in the ways that Eyal explains. The first thing I want to clarify is why all sorts of methods employed by developing countries, by developed countries singularly and nationally, cannot work, such as whatever, the climate relief thing that OO talks about. So the first thing I would notice is that there's like a money problem in funding things directly. So there's a tax that you impose on companies, which then scares off companies and means that you can't use the money again, or if it's dividing up subsidies, which hurts your fiscal capacity as a government to do other things, since obviously even if farmers are an important bloc, there are other elites in the country that want your SOE subsidies and whatever that are more close to the government. And so the loss of money means that the incentive to allow massive environmental reform is very limited. So you have to go through the legal channel in order to not impose costs on government in the form of the direct fiscal space that they have. The second thing is that we just don't think that from a legal perspective, there are other ways in which you can do this, because if we can't collude and use precedents from around the globe to back our claims, it's much harder for an agricultural lobby to make a credible decision against a firm, especially in developing countries with poor court systems that do not do their due diligence, which is why we need the ability to use a right court and to combust the amount of precedents that we have. Now let's get to the fun stuff. Why do we think that the impacts that derive from this should be most important around comparing this to the energy cost thing we get from OO? The first thing I want to talk about is the direct effects of destruction, and then I'll also weigh the move to solar as a second way of winning the debate. The first thing to talk about is the direct effects of destruction. So this both looks like the destruction of sea area, coastal areas in developing countries that then have to move, but it also looks like a destruction of agricultural crops, as Eyal explains, which OO concedes are central to these countries' economies. Why does this matter more than the increase in energy costs? First, it is a more long-term process. As OO themselves concede, if energy costs rise, that then means that you have an incentive as a firm to adjust at some point and use other forms of energy that are able to give you a competitive edge over other energy firms that are providing things at a higher cost, which means that at best it just makes the transition to solar quicker, but the destruction that we explain, whether it is the fact that agricultural industries will forever have to charge for higher prices because their quantities are much reduced if they can't grow a certain kind of crop, will last in the long run. The second thing that I want to talk about here is the economic effect that this has and why they matter more comparing directly to the energy costs they talk about. The first thing to talk about is that costs are bad rise for energy products, but there is a far wider basket of goods that they are imposing price increases on. So it's both agricultural products that are obviously more fundamental and less elastic for households that have to consume food than being able to stop your energy production, but it's also many other things because of the harm of investment that they cause. Notice that if there are mass influxes, this creates problems like shocks in real estate, where the price booms and drops, but it also hurts the agricultural industry, which is typically the most stable industry in these countries. This then decreases the amount of foreign direct investment and stable investors that want to invest into developing countries, because they are less sure they're going to get the bang for their buck from a stable investment. They'd rather invest in other stable assets that are maybe lower yield in the West, but are much more certain. This creates a cyclical problem, where as stable investors leave, more risky investors come in the form of foreign portfolio. And what they then do is incentivize more of those boom kind of activities, for example, by trading quickly in asset rises through real estate, etc., which diminishes the confidence in the country's economic certainty in the long run and withdraws more and more stable investors, creating more and more shocks where investors feel that these countries are unsafe. This reduces capital inflows into these countries overall, which means the fiscal space for governments to give things to their citizens or to alleviate whatever costs do rise on either side of the house stops. And this is universal to any sort of good. So if you don't have firms funding you, you can't drop the prices as a local firm, which means it's not just energy and agriculture, it will be whatever, housing, housing product you give because the market is now contracted when you don't have as many firms offering it. The last thing I want to note is that we have another positive externality, which is the transition to solar at the point in which it is already profitable, and the problem is just the path dependency that these firms have. Creating the strong profit incentive to move to solar quickly is a powerful tool. The reason this is good for developing countries as well is first, the fact that there is greater competition for solar than there is for fossil fuels right now. With Trump's rising tariffs and collusion among Western actors, for example, the EU's joint tariffs, many times developing countries have to sell to these countries even at higher tariffs. The difference is that solar energy is also used extensively by China and has a very big market there, which is why there's more of a bidding war for which firm sells where, which is how you have to drop tariffs and increase the output for the country providing it. Opening government.
Great. Thank you very much, DPM, for those final remarks. And to close the opening health, Yellow.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Cool. I'll take a POI probably from CG around 5 minutes. Please type your POIs in chat then. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'll address 2 things. The first thing that I'll address is the principal claim, and then afterwards I want to talk about the practical impacts of setting this precedent. First of all, in terms of the principle, our issue with the principle was never a collection of information. It was a more philosophical claim about the direct harm that is being done. Let me give you an analogy. If I have 5 different suspects for murder and someone has been murdered, it is not okay for me to seek justice in the way that I equally distribute that distributive punishment amongst people. So like everyone gets, for example, 1/5 of the jail time. In this specific case, it is true that companies have had a history of omissions. What is untrue is that the specific claim against a group of regional farmers done by a very specific company exists. And that is problematic because presumably, even if there are good practical benefits, even in the case that someone has been harmed, analogously, similarly in the case in which, for example, someone's family member had been murdered, that is not reason for us to make a critical adjudication about one direct piece of claim that has been made. So on the principle, not existing within the practical impacts, this is not an okay court decision for us to make. I'll make the rest of the claims then about the practical. So the first thing that I'll do is talk about the benefits that are talked about under their side of the house. So for example, deterrence and movement to green energy, in particular solar energy. Afterwards, I'll talk about harms as well as the comparative benefits. First of all, in terms of the benefits that are listed from side opening government, I think the first thing that I want to deal with is the transition to solar energy. The first thing that I want to note is that this is parallel analysis. So presumably if people are moving to solar energy, which they haven't done currently, then that admits that they are spending more money on rising energy costs. Because obviously if solar energy and like natural gas energy, for example, existed at the exact same price right now, people would already be largely moving to solar energy. What I want to note is that this concedes that there are large-scale impacts in terms of energy prices, which I will explain later. But a few different things that I want to do in order to weigh here. The first thing that I want to say is that in general, a company's ability to, for example, transition into greener lines of energy, even if it has been largely done to some extent right now, also relies on, for example, innovation, also relies on the expansion of, for example, solar panels. And that takes a lot of money. Presumably the short-term shock that is incurred by this decrease in energy prices, given the mechanism about decreased investor confidence from the opening government, is something that is likely to be catastrophic for those companies. What are those impacts, just really quickly to note, that Tanzim already talked about? The first thing is that a decrease in investor confidence presumably most directly leads to a decrease in stock prices amongst these energy companies, which is something that affects every single part of the economy. Like people literally put their life savings in investments into, for example, these stocks. What I want to note is that this is really, really bad for individual people, given that people's ability to, for example, not only make choices that would help them move into, for example, areas that are like less gentrified by or not gentrified, less impacted by climate change, but also their ability to do things like make environmentally conscious choices heavily relies on their ability to economically provide for themselves. And so presumably that decrease in investor confidence is something that is likely to be terminally existential for a lot of families all around the world, leading to not only unhappiness by them, but also poor environmental impacts in general. Second of all, energy is obviously a good that is used widely amongst the entire economy. Like, this is, again, something that's, they try and make the argument that, the food industry is extremely important in terms of promoting the development of specific economies. But I would just argue that, like, energy prices are much more universal. Like, presumably you need energy prices not only to run the machinery to create that food, but any other like industry ever. And so energy is obviously the much more expansive impact to care about in this debate. The final thing that I want to note is presumably that there will be also a loss in, for example, innovations or jobs as, for example, these energy companies stop expanding. This is, again, taking the best case scenario of opening government where there is no court settlements that are being dished out to other people, and this is just a deterrent impact. But one thing that I want to note really quickly about the opening government side is they spend their, like, half of their prime minister's speech talking about the reasons why, for example, farmers need to seek justice for these specific types of harms and how they don't have any other alternatives. That presumably means that companies will be shelling out, in their scenario, tons and tons of money to these farmers, which presumably in the short term is something that will heavily impact those companies and also decrease jobs in the short term, which is not something that can be changed in a similar way. One thing that I want to note on weighing in terms of this point, I want to note that most of the benefits from the opening government are very speculative and long-term. That is, for example, a decrease in foreign direct investment as a result of environmental problems that happen over a long span of time. And those are things that governments who notoriously have problems, I'll take you around like 5 minutes, sorry here, governments who notoriously have problems with, for example, bureaucracy for reasons that they already name, for example, foreign corporate influence, those governments are going to have significantly harder times adjusting in policies that create a short-term shock versus, for example, long-term policies that I think would be a lot better. Before I go on, I'll take a POI from opening government.
Your principle relies on proving they can't be quantified correctly, which we already proved they do. If you want to win on energy costs, engage with our weighings on why it is a short-term, less basic necessity, and that it affects an entire industry on our side, whereas it's a specific industry on yours.
Okay, in terms of the principle, this is not true. Just because we have information about the probabilities or the percentages of emissions does not indicate that a direct harm was done against a specific company to a specific group of farmers. Second of all, in terms of energy and engaging on energy prices, the first thing that I would note is that it's just not true that energy isn't like a short-term basic necessity. Like, people need electricity in order to power their homes, in order to cook the food that presumably other people would need. So yes, this is something that is incredibly short-term as well, and also something that is much more universal than, for example, a food market. The final thing that I want to talk about is the comparative that is available under our side of the house. What I want to note is that given that this type of court settlement exists, it is probably indications that the general populations and general sentiments are trending towards, for example, environmental protections. And that is not just available within lawsuits, that's also available within governments. But the second thing that I want to do is mitigate the extent of their benefit. Presumably, even if you have things like class action lawsuits, those take huge amounts of money in order to pay for, and those class action lawsuits are going against natural gas companies that have huge amounts of money to pay like very expensive lawyers who can drag on those court settlements, enabling all of the benefits or all of the harms that we name about courts being clogged. For all of those reasons, we're very proud to.
Great. Thank you very much, Diallo, for those very fun remarks, and that is the end of the opening half. Now moving swiftly to the closing half. Member of government, please. Here.
Alrighty. Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'll take a POI roughly round. I'll take it roughly round. Well, actually, I can't do that. I guess I'll take it at some point. Just don't spam me. All right, cool. If I'm audible, I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. So it's kind of unfortunate that this motion was drawn because I'm actually a law student. I've studied tort law quite intensively. So I'm going to give you a proper case on what actually is based off of tort law. Scrap all of opening half as to why most of their clash is off topic, and I have to explain to you what is actually the margin of impact. Because notably, opening government tries to claim something excessive. They try to think that this is going to be a fundamentally life-altering case that's going to fundamentally shift the incentive calculus of firms, that they're suddenly going to change their behaviors. While I don't want to knife and say that that's not true, I'm going to say that this is probably going to represent, if we were to do a Doctor Strange reality, a very subset likelihood of cases. And so we are going to win on likelihood and actually having a clear A to B causation chain for our argument. I think their cases have a lot more multifactorial causes, which they're not necessarily able to substantially prove represent the vast majority of cases to which this motion applies. The problem with opening opposition is that a lot of the case was just like, it's easily disprovable. Like, for example, the court system being overburdened. Like my POI explains to you, like, even if it's true, you have class action lawsuits and you have like tests of remoteness and everything else. And they're like, oh, class action lawsuits are expensive and take time. Great. If this case were successful, it means lawyers would be more likely to take a retainer, because that means they're more likely to think that this is going to be successful in the future. So it means you're going to have that money. It's not going to be coming from the pockets of these like individual farmers. If they're claiming that there's these large natural disaster funds and significant bargaining power, then maybe their like unions would be the ones to fund this too. Like, I'm unclear as to a lot of their case. A lot of it seems implausible. And then lastly, as to this idea of like the economics of this all, like ultimately speaking, this is not going to fundamentally change the economics of making these decisions and make it impossible for these businesses to continue on their actual actions. So let's get into this really epic case. It's super epic. So first, on framing, I want to point out that opening government's impact on one individual farmer getting 16K should not be definitive in this case, because it should easily be outweighed by the actual value of this case, what it can do, and what other types of benefits it promotes. That is, if I could prove more than $17,000 euros in equivalent impacts, I think we're outweighing them, assuming that everything else would be outweighed. Why is the appeal of this case likely to happen and be unsuccessful? Notably, this is specifically the German higher regional court. This is not the highest court of the land. There is the Supreme Court of that, and then there's also the European court that exists once after that happens. This case is likely to be appealed, and it is going to be it's going to be appealed because I posit to you that it is going to fail. This is because this specific theory of tort law is completely contradictory to all other theories of tort law that exist around the world and in Germany, whether it's common or civil law systems. So then, what is the negligence standard? Because notably, this is a negligence case. That is, on the part of the RWE, because they didn't take certain kinds of actions, it led to some kind of harm to this farmer, Saul, and therefore they are entitled to compensation. That is the basic theory of the case as it exists. Why is this not likely to stick? Even if, for example, this house supports the German higher regional court ruling in favor, why won't it stick later? The reason why it's likely to get overturned is because the negligence standard is of 5 elements. There's a duty of care, a breach of a standard of care, factual causation, legal causation, and damages. You have to prove each of the elements. 5 different reasons why this theory of law does not make any sense. Firstly, the mere existence of harm does not create a duty to care. It requires a level of proximity, that is, sufficient closeness and directness of relationships of parties, like physical closeness, expectations, and reliance. This makes logical sense because presumably you are not accountable for harms that do not happen nearly anywhere proximate to you. This is obviously not met in this circumstance because we're talking about Germany and we're talking about Peru, completely non-proximate countries. Second, there has to be reasonable foreseeability, which does not exist in this case because it's not necessarily clear that this specific company's actions led to the harm to this specific class of claimants. That is, it led to this exact type of environmental harms that he's claiming that's happened to his farm because of global warming and the flooding that exists. Thirdly, you consider policy considerations in making a determinants of negligence. That is, if there's potential negative effects on the legal system and contradiction of legal principles, they would never accept this type of duty of care to exist in the first place. Opening opposition was actually really correct on the law of this. Like, there's no way that allows to happen because it create effectively infinite liability for these companies in all sorts of ways. They might not be liable just as farmer, they'll be liable to everyone. Literally, companies would collapse. This wouldn't make sense. There'd be way too many jurisdictional and cross-jurisdictional claims. It's unclear if it's even consistent with the principles that exist in the law as it stands. And then lastly, causation-wise, there needs to be a causal chain between the accident and the injury sustained, but for the action of this firm, it's not clear the harms to the farmer wouldn't have happened. They could have happened for a variety of other reasons. The causation is not clear. Ultimately, this appeal is unlikely to be successful after getting Supreme Court, and so even if it was, it would be completely unpersuasive because it's so out of line with other types of jurisdictions. Why is there value in this case then being successful in the Germany higher regional court, even if it gets appealed onwards? Firstly, we're more likely to get an appeal if the initial case was successful. If it was unsuccessful as per upside, we wouldn't get an appeal. Secondly, if we're able to get this appeal to happen in the first place, then what's likely to happen is that we could have, for example, more interveners be involved. This gets more public press because it becomes a much more definitive issue that is now goes to like the Supreme Court instead of just the regional court, which means now it gets a lot more attention, a lot more value in terms of the value the case exists. And the exposure and public discussion is sticky because there's news flashpoints, there's evidence that's going to be newly submitted and new ways of discussion to involve the theory of law. Even if this case is outstanding and ridiculous, there might be some development and incremental development towards new theories of negligence that can maybe not capture this case, but capture other environmental law cases. Secondly, you have a large signaling effect that you have. In winning this case just temporarily, at least, you at least allow the environmental movement to have and be able to pursue new kinds of cases. That is, you get copycat cases in new jurisdictions, and you have new emerging landmark lawsuits on new theories of law, of tort, or anything else, because you saw that this actually happened in the moment that it actually happened. This is very important because you could refer to this case as a point of reference of it being successful. Lawyers are more likely to pick it up because it was successful, at least now, and it'll take years before this actually gets settled in the Supreme Court, which means you'll have a lot of time for all these cases to actually accrue. This is important because it's expensive, these cases, it takes time. And in the world where, for example, United States and other jurisdictions where they're appealing environmental policy very quickly, you need a certain kind of win for the global environmental movement to spur this type of action and create new theories. Which means if, for example, you get a case that makes more sense and is not as insane as this one, it's more likely to succeed because we actually brought it forward. A plaintiff saw this in use, is more likely to bring it forward. An individual lawyer is more likely to put ads on the radio wave to try to get these types of cases forward. That is the important part. This case is fucking bogus. It is dog shit and it's going to get appealed. It's what it inspires that is more likely. This is a far more likely impact than opening government and opening opposition. It is in line with the current theories of law, which I tried to explain structurally speaking, but like, trust me, bro, I took law and these are like literally precedent backed case. And ultimately, like, even if it was successful, the whole point is that like, yeah, sure, you can get some benefits in closing the global accountability gap, blah, blah, blah. But this is about the most reality. Look, this is Dr. Strange. I'm giving you a million of the cases, opening government opposition, give you one. Do we win?
All right, cool. Thank you very much, member of Gov. Now moving on to CO's first speaker, member Rob. Here.
Are you able to see and hear me?
Yes.
Amazing. 3, 2, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to very quickly knock CJ out of the round. 3 responses. Firstly, if this court gets appealed at the High Court, at the Supreme Court level, it is just likely the case that this demoralizes the environmental movement massively. The highest court in the land literally said that your court does not set any precedent, that you should not be passing these types of lawsuits. It's a massive loss on their side of the house. Secondly, we would note that in most cases, this is unlikely to cause any change on their side of the house. That is, that when the environmental movement literally sees this appeal failing at such a high level, we would posit that you're likely to feel much worse. Thirdly, this is obviously a nice to opening government. Opening government relies on the case being successful and significant precedent being set. So do with that what you will, Judge. First piece of extension. Why is it the case that this is massively harmful for sovereignty and a really big overreach on their side of the house? The premise of this argument is incredibly simple. Jurisdiction is such that you ought only be able to impose laws in your own country. Notably, this is the status quo definition of jurisdiction right now, where you are held accountable for your own country's laws. That's because those are the only laws that you've signed into, but also obviously because your government set them up. We would posit that on their side of the house, when you actively change the way that sovereignty is defined, that a court can undertake legal jurisdictions in another country, 3 specific things happen. Firstly, we would note there's a significant amount of legal uncertainty that are caused. The fact that you can now be challenged for another country's laws is massively harmful on their side of the house. Secondly, we would note that this often is liable for international frameworks. That is to say that you are unable to actively pass laws you care about on their side of the house. The second level of this, and this is where we get really, really important. This is incredibly important for national climate policy and the ability for governments to set this. I want to just be exceptionally clear on what governments do in status quo. So in status quo, governments set this policy, right? They determine how they want their emissions because obviously on our side, governments evaluate whether they want to be pro-business or anti-business. They determine this via cost-benefit calculus and say, this is why, for example, polluting in Vietnam is different from polluting in Costa Rica. And governments should be allowed to set this. That is to say that governments should have the final decision of whether we want different environmental standards in Peru versus Vietnam. That's because, firstly, these governments are often democratically elected and represent the wills of the people. So if I, as an individual, want the land around my house to maybe be slightly more polluted in exchange for a job, that is perfectly legitimate as a fair exchange. But secondly, more obviously, governments are the best suited to make these trade-offs. They aggregate your utility and make these decisions on our side of the house. So when this farmer consented into the government, we would posit that it's just the case they already opted in. What then changes on proposition side of the house? There are three specific things that I think happen. Firstly, whether you cannot control your own costs and your own climate policy. That's because you always have the exogenous factor of Germany being able to say, or an environmental organization being able to say, psych, we're going to sue you in Germany now, which often massively ups the quality of doing business in their world, their side of the house. Secondly, this takes away from existing governmental policy and makes it much harder to pass things like climate policy based on your own individual country's needs. That's to say the different countries often have different variable needs, and the only way to account for that is when you have our side of the house. Finally, though, and this is really important, panel, we think this is just a choice that should be left to the individual country rather than being based on external standards that are significantly harmful. What are the impacts of this? We think there are three specific ones. Firstly, sovereignty is incredibly important to the extent that individuals have control over their own lives and be able to determine what they use as their own natural narratives. Secondly, and this is really important, panel, versus climate cooperation literally every other area. The link here is really simple. When you think that another country could sue you, then you are less likely to work with them collaboratively on things like climate change. This often stresses the diplomatic relations that already exist and the already existing structures for climate change that exist on our side of the house. What are these alternatives? Things like the UNFCCC, that is literally a framework on an international level to actively hold countries liable for things like climate change and emissions. The fact that the Paris Climate Accords were signed on our side of the house when you don't try to hold countries liable and interfere within their effects. These are things that are much likelier to work because, one, they're significantly more collective on our side of the house, but secondly, they don't impede on your right to make certain decisions within our work. The comparative then is this. Look, countries don't get to sign their individual policies, and this massively harms their economies, this massively harms the way it functions. We would posit that our side of the house is better within this. Secondly, who does these suits? And I don't think anyone actually explains this, because we think that when the precedent is set, these suits are often not done against rich countries like the United States. Obviously, Peru often doesn't have the money to sue within the US. This is a very unique and specific case. And there are two other reasons. One, lawyers are really expensive to get within these types of rich countries. They're often charged in a higher currency than your own, so it's very unlikely that this is the type of case that you do. But also, more importantly, it's just difficult to win these types of cases when these lawsuits often extend for years, when there are massive numbers of appeal, and a large amount of court talk on side-opening government. Where do these lawsuits then happen? It is often liberal environmental organizations like the WWE, like PETA, suing from the United States and places like Pakistan and India. The reason for this is incredibly simple, Pat. Two things. Firstly, obviously a vast majority of emission happens within developing countries. So these are likely to act as sued just by premise of the fact that pollution happens here primarily because obviously these countries haven't developed to the same extent, so they don't get the suits on their side of the house. Secondly, though, it's just easier for these countries to sue. That is, they are more liberals in these areas, they have more time, and they often care more significantly about environmental issues. So those lawsuits often affect developing countries really, really badly. There are two specific ways that this then weighs on their side of the house. First, small and medium-sized businesses in developing countries are massively harmed. We would posit that this doesn't just exist to energy companies, but it exists to a local car manufacturer. It exists to Tata, which hires a large number of Indian workers, and when these people get fired, they'll literally lose their jobs on their side of the house. I'll take opening up before I move on.
Your case ignores our preemptive on why developing countries do not have democratic incentives, but lobbying ones. And even if they do, courts often fail. Do we think developing countries are able to also do the policy you want on
Yeah,
our side
these
of the house? It's
lobbying,
just an addition.
that's the problem. These lobbying incentives are the exact reason that they are very likely to get sued because environmental organizations in the West have more money than your local business. That's exactly who does the bribing. Like, I don't get it. Second piece of blame. It is just true the small and medium-sized enterprises in developing countries matter a lot. On their side of the house, when your local farmer doesn't have food put on the table, that's when they engage in significant amounts of deforestation. And take a look at the Amazon. This is the simplest example of what closing opposition point out. That is that many people in the Amazon do not having money actively engage in deforestation. Finally, I want to just engage with the principle debate, which Pranav will weigh a little bit more. Look, we don't think historical norms should be used to judge current people. There are two reasons for this. First, obviously, they didn't know this was the accountability standard they should be held under. That is to say that these laws were changed in the 2000s and 2100s. Many of these entities have been polluting for significantly longer than that. We ought not engage in retrospective liability, which is the accountability standard they would be holding these people under. But more importantly, these countries never bought into this law because it was never existent on their side of the house. So this is particularly harmful. Pranav will weigh that principle. Very proud.
All right. Thank you very much, Member Valk. Moving on now to CG's last speaker, Gabor.
Am I audible to everyone?
Yeah.
Just gonna stab up my notes. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Now, the very first thing that I want to note is the obvious reason why Daniel is winning over everyone else in the debate. Because ultimately, every other case is like founded on this needing to be successful in appeal, this like not being appealed. Daniel gives you a whole bunch of reasons, both just like because this is the way that law actually works, as well as structural reasons, even if you don't buy that, for why this case is not like legally valid enough to pass an appeal and would be unlikely to pass an appeal. So just purely because of this means that every other like team in the round is only addressing the success cases of an appeal. CG is taking the failure cases of appeal. Weigh this first on likelihood. Just because Daniel shows you why a failure case is so much more likely, all of our impacts are standing so much higher than any other team in the round. But additionally, like, note that, like, just directly like addressing this idea of this being a knife. We do not think that this is a knife. First of all, because we are not saying that appeal is completely impossible, just that it is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly unprobable, and we are therefore outweighing on likelihood. You cannot just call this a knife. But additionally, if opening government is wanting to take claims that are like factually incorrect about law in order to like say like imply that there is not a chance of appeal, or like even that there is not a very, very significant chance of appeal, we think that this is factually untrue. We do not have to defend the burden of the sky is green, and we do not have to defend tort law being something that it is not. So this basically takes out OG, differentiates us from them. We just take these failure cases instead of these success cases and are therefore more likely, therefore winning over them. Okay, next I want to address CO that just spoke. The first thing I would like to note is that their case is still, again, reliant on this like being legally correct and therefore viable in appeal. Daniel tells you why it is not. They do not actually engage with the crux of our case, which is like being able to like have like benefits to the environmental movement, being able to have like more like knowledge and awareness of the issue through the appeal. Like they are never engaging with this actual case, so we are already winning over them unless they bring up significant analysis on the whip, which would be borderline whip extension anyway. Okay, so like they do say that like okay, so what do they bring up? The first thing is that like okay, the only address they actually give to a case is that if there is an appeal, it is likely to demoralize the environmental movement because like this appeal is like unsuccessful on our side of the house. But I will say to this, that the environmental movement is probably very used to there being issues and failures. There are significant problems. They are constantly running into roadblocks. This is not going to be the one thing that like prevents them from like creating this change. We also think that the movement and the people within it are likely to be motivated by failures like this. Again, see the fact that this is likely to be hugely in the news. See all of the legal like ideas that will be coming out of this that Daniel tells you about. See the fact that there are likely to be copycat cases, because even if this case is failing, the environmental movement will see like the ways in which it is specifically failing, and through that, the ways in which other similar cases might be able to succeed if they they are like more likely to be effective in appeal. We also think there's likely to be new legal theories coming out of this, some of which will like be successful in the long term. And because you are able to get this analysis in a higher court with like there is more scrutiny on it, you are able to have more resources put towards this. You are able to achieve more benefits like towards environmental cases more generally, because a lot of like the legal theories and ideas coming out of this case will be cross-applicable to other cases. And so being able to analyze this case in more detail enables us to like have more effective cases like in the future. So we think that this failure also will not demoralize the movement, because they will see the specific benefits that come out of this, because they will see the way that this failure can lead to lessons that eventually lead to success. That because we have like these new theories, this is like actually more of a mechanism for success. The fact that the people in charge of the like environmental movement are going to be rational enough actors to understand how to continue to push for success. We also don't think that the people on the ground are going to be significantly like demoralized by this, given that like everyone paying attention to these legal cases is probably going to understand the significant implications of the new theories coming out and all of that. Okay, what else does CO tell you? They talk about like sovereignty and about countries like now not wanting to work with like each other on environmental issues. I want to note, first of all, I don't really think this is how like any of this round should be conceptualized. This is just not simply how things work. Countries already have incentives to work with each other on environmental issues. These are not going to go away because of the way in which a specific court case is being handled. Like, see incentives like actually wanting to prevent climate change, see incentives like wanting to protect their economy, see incentives like wanting to like maintain good trade relationships. They are not just going to like create a very, very high impact. So if you do buy this, it is incredibly minimal. But we also don't think that this is likely at all, because it is not countries like suing each other for this. It is just like corporations and other actors suing each other in other countries. We don't think the fact that a case is like adjudicated in a different country is going to cause significant sovereignty issues. But I will also note that all of the mechanisms that like CO brings up is simply act as like reasons why this is not likely to not be accepted in appeal, which we already say is unlikely on our side of the house. So this is not actually like taking down any of our substantive material. I also want to note that, like, even if you accept all of the case, we still think on weighing that it is overall better to have this increased attention and this increased ability to create future benefits on our side of the house. Okay, finally, on opening opposition. What is their case? They first talk about like courts being overburdened, which Daniel explains in a POI is not how things exactly work. Again, like this is, there are other solutions to courts being overburdened. Like you can go to other places, but then the most substantial case they bring is energy costs, saying that like energy is like widely used and the cost of it will rise, causing harms. I think it is unlikely to increase because like this corporation is, first of all, likely to account for some amount of like legal fees and legal issues. So they are not just going to suddenly be like so badly influenced by like this financial like strain that is imposed on them in the court. No, even if it succeeds, so it is like rather unlikely that this is going to create a significant enough knock-on effect. We again think that this minimal effect that they are maybe getting on their side of the house is way outweighed by our actual ability to create environmental change in the long run, to benefit people in the long run by creating more attention. So proud to stand on CG.
Okay, thank you very much, Gofwit. And as the final speaker in this debate, opposition whip, please.
Hi, can I confirm I'm audible and visible?
Yep, yes to both.
Thank you. Okay, POI is verbally. I repeat by voice. I'm not looking at the chat. I'll take from opening government at 5.5 minutes probably. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Closing government. If this case fails now, it also will still provide a ton of information. And that's because all of the media attention closing government wants to talk about has already happened. It is an unprecedented case, as the info slide suggests, that has already got huge amounts of media buzz. What is the unique value in it passing one additional hurdle right after closing government tells me that the hurdle it has passed is legally nonsensical? It is very unclear what this new theory you're going to find is. I think it's far more likely you're just going to demoralize the environmental movement. And their claim is like failure apparently can motivate you because you're very used to failure, which doesn't seem very logical, because presumably the fact that you're continuously failing and have failed often in the past is the reason why this new tactic that you've used, also failing, seems to just bring more despair within the environmental movement. But finally, you do not need to generate action or help from this specific thing. Like, look, it's not very clear why this lawsuit, if it succeeds, inspires others. Either it will not be because it's going to be repealed. Lawyers, like closing government says, will constantly say the media it's a stupid law and thereby nobody will ever try and surpass one. Or a lawyer will see the better case and will think, I don't need this specific case to follow and file my lawsuit because my lawsuit is anyways better and have the legal knowledge to understand it anyways. Let's talk about our extension. And I'll first talk about the pragmatic extension before I talk about the principle. The pragmatic extension we give is this, that often this specific lawsuit sets a precedent that's disproportionately used by richer nations or richer environmental organizations against poorer companies within developing nations. And the reason, trivially put, is because obviously in most instances, poorer individuals do not have the finances or the willingness to file long lawsuits that are really expensive in nations with much higher currency costs, obviously. And also because rich nations, like the ACLU or whatever environmental organization has a lot more money, right? So it's happy to file far greater number of lawsuits than a poor person will against richer people. The claim or the reason we say this is bad is because it explains why poor people in developing nations are now harmed a lot more, because now the largest oil company or gas company in their country now has to pay money on each and every single lawsuit in Germany that is often, or each and every single lawsuit whenever it's happening. And this is conceding OG, right? Because OG spent so much time explaining why this sets a great grand precedent for lawsuits in many other countries. If that is true, it's quite terrible for them. How do you weigh this against opening opposition? So ore does have a claim on energy costs, right? Energy costs fluctuate because of lack of foreign direct investment, because a lot of confidence that goes down. But will it? It's one specific lawsuit in one German court. There's no analysis from why this lawsuit will become such a big, huge change, why it's going to change the incentives of an investor. I'm sure a lot of investors will just think, well, I will still keep investing in it because I don't know if any other more capitalist court is going to indulge in this. But you know who I think it is going to change? It's going to bolster rich environmental organizations to start lawsuits of their own to a far greater extent. And the reason why they are emboldened is closing government's own mech. They are often disproportionately used to failing in many instances. They often feel like they're constantly looking for the next out. And that is the reason why, in this instance, they're quite happy to start a lot more lawsuits against developing nations that causes a chilling effect that preemptively decreases investor confidence within those poorer nations' companies that may be the sole source of employment, or at least the primary source of energy costs within that nation, right? So that, I think, is just a much better mechanism than O's marginal mechanism there. I also think that we impact this a lot better. The reason you outweigh economy against the environmental claims from OG is because poor people harm the environment a lot more than richer people. Because unfortunately, when you cannot indulge in the high efficiency natural gas of your company, you have to do terrible things like deforestation of your own forests, literally cutting down to try and get fuel that both decreases the amount of carbon that can be taken in and also harms many more people as well. I also think this beats OG. I do think OG are also going for very large impacts. Does this one lawsuit in a German court really very significantly change the entire solar market structure, especially if many of them are already having incentives to become pro-solar or become pro-environment? It's not clear that this is such a big impact anyways. And I anyways think a lot of developing nations, their governments are becoming more pro-environment, right? It's bad for business if every time smog goes into the atmosphere, some people die. Every time, into the future, you run out of more and more fuel. So you want to find more substitutable alternatives. So already on the pragmatic, we are winning. But I think we're also winning on the principle here. And I want to start by talking about what the principle was that Muzi gives to the end of his speech. He gives a sovereignty principle, which I think is still standing. But the other thing he says is that it's just terrible for historical norms to dictate the present. Look at this motion. It literally says for every single piece of emission from the Industrial Revolution in 1847, you now owe reparations to this person. But when did these laws come in, guys? They didn't even come in 1847. They didn't come in 1900. In most instances, environmental laws came in the 1960s. So you're literally retroactively punishing these companies for harms that have happened well before that. And notice why this is the most important thing, far more important than utilitarianism or an opening opposition's unweighed principle. We claim that the justice system is not about randomly deciding whether something is good or bad, but about following the law. And it's because justice are one, just they're not democratically elected, right? They should just not read the laws in whichever way they should choose, right? Often activist judging often creates a lot of polarization, and a lot of people don't think it's even always true, so it can always be reversed. And I just think stability is very important for the legal system to be believed in. It should have consistent and predictable outcomes. So the CJS's main role is to interpret the existing law and apply it, not to randomly adjudicate instances where like people are making things that aren't even against the law anyways, right? Okay, OG, you never asked the POI verbally. Given this then, I think the reason why you ought weigh this over utility is in the following instances. The first is throwing an innocent person into jail is just wrong regardless of how many lives it saves. And I do think companies have inalienable rights. I think CG even agrees this, right? They're just composed of individuals as well. To try and punish a company for 100 years of misdemeanor when they didn't even know it was a misdemeanor, when there was no law that said that it was going to be a misdemeanor, when there probably wasn't even information on climate change in the first place, is just completely wrong for us. And even if it means that, some more people are going to have like some environmental harm, even though I don't think it's very significant because it is still just one case, right? And it is still just one person. Then I think that at the very least, we ought preserve the sanctity of the law in many instances. But secondly, because I think utilitarianism, which is the basis of the top half claims, is so speculative and unfair, right? It's like the butterfly effect thing. Nobody can tell that this one individual or this one person's actions have caused all those harms, right? Which is why we don't try and adjudicate a person's decision based on how many positive or negative impacts they could get, because it's pretty speculative. What we instead decide is on the morality of an action in and of itself. Are there rights that have been denied? We suggest that the company has the right to indulge in policies that are legal. And thereby the CGS must definitely never, regardless of pragmatic costs, rule in favor of Lliuya. For all those reasons, oppose.
All right, thank you very much, Opposition Whip, for those very fine remarks, and thank you very much, everyone, for an excellent debate. That is the end of round 4, and since this is a closed/silent round, you are welcome to leave the breakout room as well as the Zoom entirely. If you have any questions regarding the results, feel free to ask me, but only after the break tomorrow. Thank you once again.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And Alex, if we could ask the recording to be stopped. Hello, Orcom, are you there?